The file did not look dramatic. A drawer slid open in a museum collection. Inside were teeth, fragments of jaw, bits of petrous bone, each one wrapped, labeled, and stripped of almost everything except context. Site name. Layer. Species, perhaps. Date, uncertain. Some had spent decades in storage under the assumption that they belonged to the earliest dogs on Earth. Others had been treated more cautiously, as wolves that happened to die near humans. To the naked eye, many of them sat on the edge between two worlds. That was the problem. For more than a century, the origin of dogs has been told as if it ought to be easy to recognize. Somewhere, long ago, wolves drew close to human camps. The boldest or tamest survived. People tolerated them, then used them, then bred them. A wolf became a dog, and from there the story moved forward. But the bones kept refusing to cooperate. Skulls called dog-like turned out to be ambiguous. Teeth seemed too small, then not small enough. Some Ice Age canids looked halfway domesticated and halfway wild, as though evolution itself had paused mid-sentence. And behind every specimen sat the same missing link question: if dogs were already with us that early, where was the clean ancestral trail that should connect them to the animals sleeping on our floors now? Ancient DNA did not solve that question in one stroke. It did something more unsettling. It reopened the entire case. When researchers began extracting genetic material from prehistoric dogs and wolves at scale, the expectation was simple enough. Sequence the oldest canids, compare them to modern wolves and dogs, and the first origin should come into focus. Perhaps Europe. Perhaps Siberia. Perhaps East Asia. Perhaps somewhere in the Near East. For years, each region had its defenders. Each had fossils, arguments, and plausible ecological logic. Then the genomes arrived. And almost immediately, the official narrative began to fracture. One of the earliest major surprises was that all ancient and modern dogs studied so far appear to share ancestry from a lineage distinct from present-day wolves. That sounds technical, but its implications are severe. It means the dog did not emerge from any wolf population still living on Earth in recognizable form. The animal that gave rise to dogs was either transformed beyond recovery, absorbed into later populations, or simply gone. In other words, the first chapter of the dog story may have no living witness. That finding alone changed the field. For years, modern wolves had been treated as though one surviving population might still hold the key to dog domestication. Ancient DNA shifted the search backwards into the late Pleistocene, into a colder and more unstable world where wolf populations were structured differently, ranged differently, and in some cases no longer exist. And then a second problem emerged. By around 11,000 years ago, dogs were already too diverse. Genomic work on ancient dogs from Europe, Siberia, and the Near East showed that by the boundary between the Pleistocene and the Holocene, there were already at least 5 major ancestry lineages. Not breeds in any modern sense, but deep populations, one associated with the ancient Near East, others with Karelia, Baikal, the early Americas, and the lineage that would later feed into the New Guinea singing dog and Australian dingo. This was a forensic contradiction of the first order. If major dog lineages were already widely differentiated 11,000 years ago, then the origin of dogs had to be older than that, probably several thousand years older. Dogs were not a byproduct of farming. They predated agriculture, livestock, villages, and the settled world in which domestication is usually imagined. The first domestic animal did not arise in a field. It arose among hunter-gatherers. That point sounds almost familiar now, but its consequences are still not fully absorbed. It means the earliest domestication we know may have taken place in small mobile societies with no written record, no architecture built to last, and no obvious institutional machinery for controlled breeding. The origin of the dog belongs to a human world before states, before crops, before pottery in many places. A world harder to reconstruct, and therefore easier to mythologize. So the case became more difficult precisely as the evidence improved. Ancient DNA was clarifying some things while making others harder. It showed that the old single-line picture was too simple. But it also made clear that modern dogs could not be traced back by drawing a neat arrow from one present-day wolf population to one place on a map. The ancestral terrain was older than that. Then another layer came into view, one that made the history stranger still. A large genomic study of ancient wolves suggested that dog ancestry is best explained not by one obvious wolf source, but by at least 2 deep ancestral components, an Eastern Eurasian-related lineage and a Western Eurasian-related lineage. Early dogs in Siberia, the Americas, East Asia, and northeastern Europe seem to derive overwhelmingly from the eastern side of that ancestry. Early Near Eastern and African dogs, and later many European dogs, carry a significant Western contribution. That does not necessarily mean dogs were domesticated twice in a clean and separate way. The evidence does not warrant that kind of certainty. But it does mean that the ancestry of dogs was braided from deep wolf structure in a way the older models did not anticipate. The simple story had been, wolf, then dog. The emerging story was more like this: ancient wolf populations were already diverse, some of that diversity no longer survives, and the ancestry of dogs appears to preserve elements of more than one of those vanished worlds. This is where the remains in the drawers start to matter again. Because once those broad patterns were visible, researchers could return to individual bones and ask more dangerous questions. Was this famous specimen really a dog? Was that supposed Ice Age dog actually intrusive, a younger bone that slipped into older sediment? Was another sample contaminated by modern DNA? Could morphology alone have turned borderline wolves into honorary dogs because the field wanted the answer too early? In several cases, the answer was yes. Sites long cited in discussions of very early European dogs, places like Goyet, Predmosty, and Nerschel, became objects of renewed scrutiny. Some remains from these contexts, once held up as evidence of extremely ancient domestic dogs, did not survive genomic or radiocarbon re-evaluation in the way many expected. In some cases, the bones proved younger than the surrounding sediments. In others, the data pointed to contamination or later deposition. The cave layers were ancient. The dog bones were not always as ancient as the story built around them. That is the kind of reversal only forensic work can deliver. Not the discovery of a sensational new fossil, but the quiet demolition of evidence everyone had grown used to citing. And once those older claims weakened, another specimen gained new weight. A dog from Kesslerloch in Switzerland, around 14,200 years old, now stands as one of the earliest confirmed dogs at genome-wide resolution in Europe. It matters not simply because it is old, but because it is securely anchored. It tells us that by the late Upper Paleolithic, dogs were unquestionably real and already genetically distinct. They were not experimental half-wolves hovering in interpretive fog. They belonged to a lineage recognizably within the history of dogs. But even Kesslerloch did not restore simplicity. Its ancestry is unusual enough to raise questions of its own, including links to a component later seen in Southwest Asian dogs. Which means that even among these very early confirmed dogs, population structure was already present. There was no pristine moment in which one first dog stood alone and unambiguous at the beginning of history. The record opens onto diversity. That helps explain one of the most persistent oddities in the field. The dog-human relationship often tracks human history closely, but not perfectly. In broad terms, dog genomes and human genomes from the same times and places often move together. Farmer expansions helped move dogs. Human migrations carried dog lineages into new regions. Dietary change shows parallels too. Variants related to starch digestion expanded in many dog populations as agricultural lifeways spread, echoing adaptations seen in human populations eating starch-rich diets. But the parallel is not exact. That is important. When steppe pastoralist ancestry transformed large parts of human Europe in the late Neolithic and Bronze Age, the dog story did not mirror the human story in a simple one-to-one replacement. In some cases, incoming people appear to have adopted local dogs rather than replacing them entirely. Elsewhere, dogs seem to have shifted more dramatically than nearby human populations did. The partnership is old, intimate, and visible in the DNA, but it is not mechanical. Dogs were companions, tools, symbols, traded animals, camp followers, and living property. Their movements depended on humans, but not always on the same terms as human ancestry itself. And beyond population history, there is a second archive in the bones, not where dogs came from, but what they meant. A Paleolithic burial at Bonn-Oberkassel in Germany, around 14,000 years old, contains the remains of a dog buried with two humans. Pathological analysis suggests the young animal suffered a serious illness, likely canine distemper, and survived long enough that it may have required sustained human care. That finding does not tell us where dogs originated. It tells us something just as important. By the time dogs enter the archaeological record securely, the relationship may already have moved beyond opportunism. Not just tolerated scavengers. Not just useful hunters. Sometimes, evidently, creatures worth nursing through suffering. That emotional depth matters because domestication is often described too coldly, as though it were merely a transaction between species. Ancient DNA corrects one half of the picture by showing how complex the ancestry was. Archaeology corrects the other by showing how complex the bond may already have been. So what, finally, has ancient DNA revealed about the origin of dogs? Not a single birthplace with a pin stuck in it. Not a triumphant return to a favorite old theory. And not the comforting idea that somewhere on Earth a living wolf population still preserves the dog in ancestral form. What it has revealed is harder and more credible. Dogs seem to descend from an ancient wolf lineage that no longer survives in pure form. Their diversification began deep in the late Pleistocene, well before agriculture. By 11,000 years ago they had already split into major regional ancestries. Their deeper ancestry reflects at least an Eastern and Western Eurasian structure that complicates any one-origin fairy tale. Some of the earliest supposed dogs failed under modern scrutiny. Some confirmed dogs arrived already bearing the marks of prior population history. The beginning, when it comes into view, is not singular and clean. It is old, branching, and partly missing. That missingness is not a flaw in the evidence. It is part of the truth. Domestication happened in a world of Ice Age mobility, shifting prey, unstable climates, and human societies that left sparse traces compared with later civilizations. The first steps were taken so early, and under such conditions, that we should not expect the record to preserve a neat ceremonial beginning. The dog did not enter history under a spotlight. It emerged through repeated contact, selection, tolerance, and separation from wolves over generations long enough to erase the simplicity of the event itself. Which is why the ancient genomes matter so much. They do not just tell us that dogs were older than we thought, or more diverse than we thought, or descended from vanished wolves. They tell us that one of humanity's most intimate relationships began before the kinds of societies we usually associate with control and design. Before herding. Before agriculture. Before cities. The first animal to cross fully into the human world did so in the company of hunter-gatherers. And perhaps that is why the origin has been so difficult to pin down. We have been looking for the beginning as if beginnings are supposed to be obvious. But some beginnings are only visible in fragments. A tooth in a cave layer. A corrected radiocarbon date. A genome pulled from powdered bone. A burial where illness was not abandoned. A lineage that no longer has a living wolf to represent it. Under forensic light, the dog stops looking like a solved story and starts looking like a survivor from a vanished ecological and human order. If you want to keep following that kind of evidence-led history, stay with us. Because the truth ancient DNA finally revealed was not that we had the wrong place by a few hundred miles. It was that the origin of dogs was never the tidy event we imagined. It was deeper, messier, and more anciently human than the old story allowed. And once you see that, even the quiet dog at the edge of the room seems to carry a very long memory.